Welcome back to Steve Beacham's Kitchen, where we are going to talk to you about a major development in Midtown Atlanta. This is not only one of the most iconic parts of Atlanta, but it is the most iconic part from the last 25 years. I'm talking about Atlantic Station. If you've been here, you've driven up the connector, you've seen there's this cluster of buildings on the west side of the highway, just north of Georgia Tech. And how did this come to be? It was built in the early 2000s, but what was there before? We're gonna dive into that today. Our story starts in 1901, the Atlanta Steel Hoop Company. They were established right on a 140-acre site just north of the Georgia Institute of Technology. And at the time, the South's economy was very reliant on the agricultural products, but this was kind of a first step towards getting more into the industrial part of our economy. So they got their footing in 1906. They started producing their first steel products, and by 1915, they had changed the name to Atlantic Steel Company, which, if you've heard the story, this is how you've known it today. The mill became a cornerstone of Atlanta's industrial landscape. They employed 2,000 employees, and then everything was great for decades. And in the 70s, that was when things started to change. Rising production costs, urban encroachment made operations less viable. So the city started building up around it, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's this steel plant right in the middle of things. So it kept going. The facility struggled to compete with other groups, other people producing steel for a cheaper amount. And then this group called Iveco, they ended up purchasing Atlantic Steel and ceased operations completely right before Christmas 1998 on December 23rd. So from there, they basically sat on it. The site was a brownfield. It had been under production for steel for almost 100 years. It was contaminated with heavy metals and chemicals. So it sat there, and then right around the same time, late 90s, that was when people started getting ideas of, hey, maybe we could develop this property. Midtown's starting to grow and the city continues to push. So a lot of developers were taking a swing at the property, but 1997, Jim Jacoby ended up acquiring the property with a bold vision to transform the old mill into a mixed-use community, which at the time, this was a more or less new concept of live, work, play. We're gonna have office, retail, housing, all of it's gonna be right here. You never have to leave. We're gonna have an amazing time all at Atlantic Station. And interesting enough, Brian Leary, a Georgia Tech architecture student, had the thesis that really reimagined the site. So Brian Leary and Mr. Jacoby, they ended up meeting, and Jacoby hired him on the spot as a consultant for the project. Now, there's some interesting similarities to the Beltline. It's another Georgia Tech student, and those techies are pretty smart. They're helping shape our city. So redevelopment faced a couple of significant obstacles. First, we've talked about the site was a brownfield. What does that mean? It's full of chemicals, full of all these metal shrapnel and stuff. You can't just put an apartment complex on what we deem as a brownfield. So they had to do extensive remediation, pulling up a ton of the dirt, cleaning it out. The demolition of the mill began in 1999. Cleanup wasn't completed until 2001. The next big hurdle was financing. So while largely driven by private investment, the project relied on a TAD, or tax allocation district, which is what they're doing over at Centennial Yards today. This was established in 1999. This allowed future property tax revenues to fund public infrastructure like streets, sidewalks, and sewers. It's a great mechanism, and it's a way for the city to encourage developers to make developments happen. So the last one is that a major regulatory challenge arose with Atlanta's air quality issues. Right next to the highway, you got, hundreds, thousands of cars that are going by every day. So the city they really hadn't met their Clean Air Act standards, which was a thing at the time. They had complicated plans, and a critical highway bridge over 75-85 was really necessary for this site to work. If it was just there, they didn't have a major thoroughfare. It's interesting because you don't use that road a ton today, but at the time, the way they had mapped things out, they were like, this project's gonna fail if we don't have this big bridge. So they ended up jumping through some loops and hoops. Under standard EPA rules, they could easily have blocked the construction of this bridge. However, this thing called Project XL, and Jacoby, the EPA, Georgia's government got involved, local authorities, they all kind of came together and said, hey, we need to make a special exception for this big project. We need this for the viability of Midtown. So they gave a variance and kind of a wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We're gonna make an exception for this. So they built the bridge. So those were your three big hurdles. Once they got through that, construction was, guns a-blazing. The project ended up having its first residents move in October of 2003, just a couple of years later. And then the main opening that most people remember is fall of 2005. And I remember, really early on going to IKEA and Dillard's and Targets. Those are the main staples of that area, and they're still there today. One other thing I want to point out is just down the street from kind of the main city center of Atlantic Station, you'll see this thing that looks like the Arc de Triomphe in France. And it kind of looks a little out of place. You'll drive by and it's like, huh, interesting. No complaints, it looks good. It's a nice architectural feature, but why is it there? That Millennium Gate is a 12,000 square feet museum. You can go in, there's a ton of American history in there. The story that I've heard is right around the time of the Atlantic Station's construction, 2001, 9/11, this memorial and Millennium Gate project was supposed to go up to DC, and they had plans for it to be way bigger than it is here in Atlanta. But with 9/11, things being on lockdown, that project really hit some major hurdles. And so they're like, hey, we have a plot of dirt over here at this new exciting project here in Atlanta. Why don't we just put it there? So that's exactly what happened. So today, it's a museum. You should stop by. It's a cool little spot. Yeah, that's your story on Atlantic Station. Thanks for tuning in.